Let's bring in Chris Stigall.
He is Chris Stigall. Chris Stigall.
I'm joined now by Chris Stigall,
host of the Chris Stigall Show.
So let's bring in talk radio host Chris Stigall.
Also, his podcast is a must-listen every day. Chris Stigall Show podcast.
And host of the Chris Stigall Show.
Let's bring in Chris Stigall.
Please welcome Chris Stigall.
The Chris Stigall podcast is presented by usmedicalplan.com. Save big money monthly and get better health coverage at usmedicalplan.com.
Well, hey there, and Merry Christmas. Thanks a lot for downloading the Chris Stigall Show podcast. I want to tell you at chrisstigall.com, beyond just the Harumph Society, where I hope you'll sign up, I have a link. We're doing a drawing. Salem is giving away an inaugural trip for two, a VIP experience, including airline tickets, hotel accommodations, tickets to the presidential inauguration, tickets to an inaugural ball, and a $600 Visa gift card. All you got to do is sign up. It's going to be randomly selected. So I have the link at chrisstigall.com. No obligation to do anything, no purchase necessary, none of that stuff. Just fill out the form. Click on the link at chrisstigall.com and fill out all the information, and you could win that presidential inaugural experience. Maybe I'll see you there, since I'm going to be there. And Merry Christmas. Check it out. That's all at chrisstigall.com. Got a great show for you today, as I think we always do. Hope you enjoy it. Your 5-star reviews and your written reviews at Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify are always much appreciated. John Ruhlman is the guy that makes this show possible. He's the title sponsor of the show. He keeps the lights on. We've been so grateful to have his sponsorship. Looking forward to working with him again in the new year. I know my parents are. This is a true story. usmedicalplan.com. My folks logged on. They checked it out. They did some reading online. Then I set up a meeting for them with my buddy John. And John and his team went to work. My folks are retired. They have the income they're having for the rest of their life. It's locked. And they're Medicare patients as well. They have to buy supplemental health insurance. They're trying to save costs like everybody else. And you know what was so cool? Was they called me when it was over and they said, John was so incredibly nice to work with Chris. He took great care of us and he saved us hundreds of dollars. And then I reached out to John and I said, John, thank you for taking such great care of my parents. They said you were fantastic. And he said, it felt like taking care of my parents. You know, he enjoyed them, but I thought that was such a nice sentiment. That's how John feels about all of his clients and his entire team. They're trained that way. Brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, friends, neighbors, parents. They care about their customers. They want to save you money. They want to save you much, much more money than you're paying right now for your health insurance premiums and make sure that your coverage is always the best it can be. You may not have great coverage now and you don't even know it. Maybe you're paying too much for substandard health insurance when you could get much better coverage at a cheaper rate. You won't know if you don't call, and I really do hope you investigate it. It's not going to take you too much time. 877-410-4321. 877-410-4321 or usmedicalplan.com.
Hey, Chris.
Mr. Kennedy, welcome to the show.
Very good to meet you.
I appreciate your time today. I got to tell you something right off the top. It was sort of interesting, apropos of nothing. I was just in Seattle, and it was my first visit there. We were there with some listeners on a trip, and I went to the Space Needle for the first time. And in the entryway of the Space Needle is a tribute to its opening at the World's Fair, and it featured a picture of what I believe was you with your dad attending that function. And
yeah, I remember going up there, and at the top of that, it was very unusual during those, at that time, because it was the first rotating restaurant ever. When you go to the top of the Space Needle, there's a restaurant up there. At least there was at that point. I haven't been up there in years, and the restaurant, when it moved around in the circles calculated to give you a panoramic view of Seattle over, let's say, a 35-minute lunch.
Yes.
And
it's the restaurant isn't there anymore. It still does rotate, and the reason I bring it up is not just for the memory's sake, but it was a lovely tribute to a time, Mr. Kennedy, when there was, I think, tremendous optimism and kind of this can-do spirit and sort of a thought about the future of the country. You saw people nicely dressed, these families going to dinner in this neat new restaurant, and I just thought, gosh, that is a long ago era, Mr. Kennedy.
Well, that was, it was an interesting era for us because, of course, it was a year after my uncle was killed.
Yes.
And my father was sort of just recovering from that that was a trauma that shattered him personally. And he then made a decision to run for the United States Senate. And this was one of the first trips that we took after that. And we went out there with Justice William O. Douglas, who, was a native of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. And we went fishing. We went on a 10-day pack trip with him on the Olympic Peninsula. He taught me how to fly fish at that time, which became a lifelong passion. And then we went salmon fishing in Puget Sound and caught more fish than I'd ever seen.
Wow.
And we spent that summer touring the national parks. And for me, it was a wonderful summer spent with my father in the wilderness and outdoors.
And though tragic for your father, what was so this predated me. I'm a little younger, but what I know about that period in history was when the president's life was taken, your father's life was taken. Those were national tragedies that pierced the heart of all Americans, because I think there was a time when there was a real reverence and a respect for the office, regardless of party. I guess I can't necessarily speak for everyone, but and God forbid anything like that ever happen again. Are we in a different place as a culture in this country today than then, when looking and talking about the presidency?
Yeah, I think we are. I think, I think the driving forces behind that have been the United case in 2008, which allowed for corporate donations to federal political candidates had been illegal since 1908. And all of a sudden, the Supreme Court said, actually, corporate donations are speech. They're protected by the First Amendment, and it's unconstitutional to regulate it. And that unleashed billions of dollars. I think this presidential election is going to cost about $20 billion, billion with a B, and that money is investments by corporations into the political process, so that our politics became purchasable. I think more and more Americans distrust the government. They think the system is rigged, and they're right about that, and that it's not on their side, it's on the side of the big shots. And that's been amplified by this huge amount of money going to politics. If you're a politician, you need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to run for Senate, which means you spend your day on the telephone with millionaires and billionaires, and you really have no time for the little guy. And more and more, the little guy is
Yeah, Mr. Kennedy, your phone's cutting out on me a little bit, so sorry to jump in. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but I'll move to my next question, and maybe our signal will pick up a little bit if you can hear me, which is, my next question is, I know what you've said about your father's assassination, and I know that media likes to talk about, in fact, I was just doing some news reading about you, and a lot of the left-leaning media is attacking you for things that they perceive you've said about 9/11. Look, the point is, you believe, and I think most Americans believe, the government, in many cases, in many ways, is ill-intended, not working for the folks, and in fact, in some cases, conspiring against the folks. And I wonder, when do you think that happened? I mean, if it goes back as far as your father's death, did it go farther? Was there a time when the United States government was pure as the wind-driven snow? Were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, or was that never a thing?
No, it was, and when I grew up in an era when it was literally inconceivable that the government would lie to the American people. And the first time that actually it occurred to Americans was in May of 1960, so right after my uncle won his election. President Eisenhower was supposed to go to the Soviet Union to explore Détente with Khrushchev. And the Soviets shot down a U-2 over Russia, which is the CIA spy plane. Nobody knew about it. It was a totally secret project. It flew at 90,000, 100,000 feet. You couldn't see it with was radar. It was invisible to the naked eye, and they had been flying over Russia, and because we had a spy at Langley, the mole at Langley had told the Russians how to shoot it down, and they had shocked everybody by shooting it down. The pilot was under instructions to commit suicide, and he had an arsenic kit with him. His name was Gary Francis Powers, but he didn't do it. He instead parachuted to the ground. He was captured by the Russians. But the Russians didn't reveal they had him. They just said they had shot down a spy plane and accused the United States of breaking international laws to fly over their territory illegally. Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, told Eisenhower, the pilot is dead. They'll never be able to prove this. Just deny it. And Eisenhower did that. And Khrushchev produced the pilot 2 days later, and the whole world knew that the United States had lied to them, and the American people knew that our government had lied. And that was the first time it occurred to Americans that the government can actually lie to Americans. And then, after my uncle's death in 1963, the Warren Commission report came out, and 60% of Americans did not believe that. And then in 1973, the Pentagon Papers were released, which showed that the Pentagon officials had been lying to the public for 20 years. They knew the war was not going to work, and they had lied and lied and lied. And we had, 56,000 Americans had been killed. So, and then after that, I think, we just assume today the government is lying to us, but it didn't. And our regulatory agencies were the gold standard for the world. Everybody imitated them. Nobody had anything like NIH, like the National Institute of Health. The research coming out of there was used on nations all over the world. The FDA, Latin American governments commonly would have rules, and African governments that, because they didn't have their own FDA, they didn't have their own scientific research agencies. And they would say, well, whatever FDA approves, it's approved in our country. So everybody in the world relied on the integrity and the independence of U.S. agencies, and that is no longer true.
And to that point, and Robert F. Kennedy joins us, the story I saw just today, literally hours ago before you and I were slated to talk, was a headline from Newsweek: Joe Biden moves against RFK Jr. after Supreme Court win. And they're talking about, of course, what happened in the Murphy versus Missouri case. They look at that as a Biden win, which, of course, it really wasn't. It wasn't in support of the Biden administration censoring anything. It was sort of a punt by the Supreme Court. But the way the media writes it was like this big victory that government can, in fact, silence people like you on stands like The Shot, for instance. And this whole Newsweek piece basically celebrates, here comes Biden ready to come at you about the tweets you posted about the vaccine.
Yeah, well, you're right about that case. There were two companion cases. One of them brought by the attorney generals of Missouri and Louisiana about censorship and about the systematic censorship, and they won in the lower courts. There's a 155-page decision that accused the Biden administration of the worst acts of censorship in the 283-year history of our country, of directing censorship in the media and the social media on all kinds of policies, beginning with COVID, but then moving to Ukraine war, et cetera. There was a companion case that was called Kennedy versus Biden. That was my case. My case was filed slightly later. So when the Murphy versus Biden made the Supreme Court, my case was not attached to it. And the Supreme Court threw out the Murphy versus Biden case, saying they didn't, as you say, they punted. They threw it out on a technicality, saying the attorney general, since they were not personally injured by the censorship, did not have standing to sue. Well, my case, of course, I would have standing. So, I think it's pretty clear I would have won that case. And my case is now headed up there. But the White House, as you point out, has said, okay, the Supreme Court says it's okay for us to censor, so let's let it loose. And I think it's exactly the opposite of the reaction that you would want.
I know you're running against both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, so I'm mindful when I ask you this question this way that you're probably not inclined to throw in and say, oh, yeah, Chris, 100% I agree. But I do have to ask you, as we've watched what's gone on with Trump in these court cases and what you've experienced and what he's experienced in his campaign, the weaponization of the government seems to be coming almost exclusively and singularly for those in opposition to the people in control at the moment. At least that's my read on it. Does that unify you or give you an empathetic point of view to Donald Trump at all? Do you share anything that way?
I've spoken out against those cases, and I don't not because the cases necessarily don't have merit. I'm not going to comment on the merit, but it's prosecutors in this country going back in British times prior to the American Revolution, the British Crown would oftentimes bring trumped up charges against members of Parliament to make it so that Parliament could not meet when the king was worried they would do something that would displease him. And the framers of our Constitution were very much aware of that, and they gave prosecutors discretion, hoping they would exercise that discretion. Prosecutors face a delicate balance when a chief executive officer is accused of a crime, because you want to make sure that the American system, that nobody is above the law, but you also want to make dead sure that there's an optic that the courts and the prosecutors are politically neutral, or otherwise the public is going to lose faith in them. And, my father, when he got Justice Department, one weekend, he called all the division heads, the bureau heads together, and he said, whatever we do, there is no prosecution. We never ask whether somebody's Democrat, Republican. There's no political prosecution in this. That, unfortunately, has not been the rule or the practice of this administration. And by the way, I'll bring in President Trump here too, because he can't be utterly exculpated, because he kind of started it by saying, he was going to name a prosecutor to prosecute Hillary Clinton, and leading the chance of lock him up. And I think that feeds into the weaponization. But President Trump has been more victimized by it. That scenario, the shocking scenario, when 51 CIA agents and officers and leaders of the agency signed a letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian disinformation fake, a week before the debate, at the request of Anthony Blinken, who was then President Biden's campaign director. That was the most shocking intrusion of a federal enforcement agency into the American, political system, at least since the FBI scandals during the Nixon era, spying on Martin Luther King, etc. President Biden's choice to deny me Secret Service protection is another example of the weaponization of this. I've been very outspoken about the cases against Donald Trump, saying that it has the optics that the Democrats believe that they cannot win, that their candidate cannot win this election on his own, and that they have to instead use the legal system to get rid of or to undermine his opponents. And that's a bad thing. I remember about a month ago, President Biden criticizing Vladimir Putin, who just won 88% of the vote in the Russian elections. And President Biden was saying, well, of course he did that by making sure his opponents couldn't get on the ballot, and by censoring, by telling the press to censor his opponents. Well, Yeah, that's probably true, but President Biden is guilty of the exact same thing. So it was an irony, to say the least.
I know your time is short, so I want to get two last questions in, if you don't mind. Number one, could I get your reaction? I'm sure you've been asked about it. Were you watching that debate between Biden and Trump, and then your reaction to it, if so?
Well, we staged a debate simultaneously in which we used technology essentially to put me on the stage with them. So I was on the stage with them during my own debate, which was simulcast, at the same time and answering the same questions they did. And our debate actually got 3 times the number of viewers as did CNN. We had 11 million viewers that evening.
Wow.
So yeah, I watched the debate. If you want to know my impression of what of President Biden's performance, I was not surprised. And because that's what I expected, because I had been watching President Biden for the past year and watching what, this apparent cognitive deterioration and marveling that anytime anybody mentioned it, that they would be gaslighted by the press. Even when the Wall Street Journal ran a story about it, they got hammered and gaslighted and vilified for saying things that weren't true. And so the surprising thing for me was that everybody acted so surprised about his condition, because I think anybody who was paying attention would have seen that, been aware of that for a long time, and it would not have been surprising.
This is the thing that I wanted to ask you, because what baffles me is to watch the Democrats meeting this week, trying to decide whether they want to hang with him or not. All of the media that has supported him heretofore is now saying he's got to go. And I couldn't help but think of you sitting out there as a guy who has been a lifelong Democrat thinking, well, what the hell? Here I am, and they've treated you this way. I mean, are you feeling a little, isn't there irony in that? Now they're looking for a replacement for a guy, and you're like, well, here I am, I would guess is how you're feeling.
Yeah, I mean, this whole 15-month journey has been, I've had a lot of kind of has provoked a lot of raised eyebrows. My numbers are now better than President Biden. They've always, in a head-to-head race, I have consistently beaten in every poll President Trump, and President Biden has been uneven for the past 18 months. Over the past 4 months, he can't beat Trump in any poll, in any configuration. If in a 3-way race, President Biden loses. In a 2-way race, if I dropped out, he loses even worse. But now I can beat. Our numbers still show that I beat President Trump, and no other Democrat can, or no Democrat can. So you would think in a perfect world that the Democratic Party would maybe come to me and ask me if I would run, because their big issue now is, their only issue really is how to keep Trump out of office. But I don't see that that's going to happen. I think the donor class is probably more frightened of me than they are of Donald Trump.
So just so I'm clear that I heard you right, if the Democrats came to you today and said, Mr. Kennedy, we've rethought things, we would really like you to step in here. Biden's out, we want you to step in. Would you accept?
I almost certainly would, because I think it would guarantee me the presidency, whereas in a 3-way race, that's much less certain.
And so if you were to go on to become president as an independent right now in a 3-way race, do you find that you would probably be more inclined to work with Democrats than Republicans? Or would you continue as an independent?
I would not be looking for anybody's party affiliation. I just want, and this is what I said from the beginning, it's time to end the vitriol, time to end the partisanship. There's people on both sides that anybody who loves this country above their consider for appointments. That's what we need in this country. We need to put aside the anger, the tribalism. It is tearing our country apart, and we need to have a genuine, and I like surrounding myself with people who don't agree with me on every issue. My staff is filled with people who differ with me on all the different issues. My vice president doesn't agree with me, and I don't care. I just want people who are thoughtful, who can make an argument, who have the information, and who are passionate about our country. And that's the only thing I care about.
I'm sure there are many things, and I know you got to run. There are many things you and I don't agree on politically, but I will say that when I look you up in just the basic news headlines of the day from the traditional media, they are savaging you right and left. I mean, they're working hard, as you know, and that's not new to you, but I mean, they're working hard overtime to make you look like a straight-up discredited kook, who eats dogs and doesn't believe 9/11 was real, and on and on and on. And I like when you get that kind of treatment, that tells me you're somebody they're awfully afraid of. I do believe that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's hardly I would say this. I don't know of a single article written about me in the mainstream media over the past 2 years that's been true. That's accurately stated my position on issues, whether it's vaccines or my father's assassination, my uncle's assassination, on COVID, on the lockdowns, whatever. I just don't think there's any impulse to tell the truth. It's all kind of agenda-driven journalism to make me look, as you say, like a crackpot, to marginalize and vilify me, that's I'm not complaining, by the way. That's what the political system is today.
And I will say, I know you've come under great scrutiny by your own family. So I don't think you're doing this for vanity's sake. I think you've probably taken a lot of slings and arrows internally, personally, from your party, and then the media, as we said. So, I mean, I commend you. Like I said, we may not agree on much, but I commend you that you put yourself out there at what I assume is great personal cost to you, both financially and just personally as a man.
Yeah, but there was a whole generation of Americans who, in 1776, who put their fortunes on the line, who put their livelihoods and their lives on the line to give us the Constitution. And if we're not willing to make those kind of sacrifices in our generation, we're going to lose the rights and the country and the values that were their gift to us. So, I know for me, my sacrifice is pretty trivial. Any sacrifice I make is pretty trivial compared to the sacrifice they made.
Mr. Kennedy, I am grateful for your time, and you're certainly always welcome back throughout this campaign cycle, but I thank you very, very much for spending some time and visiting with the audience today.
It was a pleasure talking to you. We'll talk to you again, Chris.
Well, our friends and sponsors and Harumph founders, most importantly, Gulag America. They want to wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And to help you celebrate in witty and always irreverent style, you can take advantage of those pre-Brandon, pre-inflation prices. Just $24. Standard T-shirts through the end of the year, that's all they cost. $24 if you use my promo code, and that's key, Chris, the number 10. So it's Chris10 to take 10% off the entire order of apparel and other great gear. It's all at gulagamerica.com. And for great last-minute gift ideas, right up to and including the big day itself, you can purchase and print Gulag America gift cards on demand, right from home or your office. Now, there is no discount on the purchase of gift cards, I should clarify, but you can pass along the discount code Chris10 to whomever you give the gift card, and they can use that promo code with their gift card to save just the same. Take 10% off their apparel, an added gift. It's exclusively from our friends and sponsors at Gulag America, and we are grateful for them and thankful for them this holiday season. At Gulag America, you know they're saying, it's not their wish, but it is their warning. So a little something popped up on social media yesterday that interested me, I will be honest, because I'm in the business of broadcast. It's always been a business that's been important to me and matters to me. I typically don't do a lot of shop talk about the business because I'm not entirely sure how many of you are interested in it. But I do think when it comes to programming that you enjoy, shows or hosts that you're listening to, And that given that we live in a world now where people like AOC say things like this week.
I do think that several members of Congress in some of my discussions have brought up media literacy because that is a part of what happened here. And we're going to have to figure out how we rein in our media environment so that you can't just spew disinformation and misinformation. It's one thing to have differing opinions, but it's another thing entirely to just say things that are false. And so that's something that we're looking into.
Right. So when politicians start talking about reining in our media environment and how you just can't be allowed to spew misinformation and disinformation. We know Mark Zuckerberg has recently testified that official Washington was telling him to silence and truncate certain voices that disagreed with their policies, and he says he regrets that now. So when an FCC commissioner speaks up in open testimony and says he has concerns about a potential buyer of hundreds of radio stations being fast-tracked as opposed to going through the ordinary course of business to purchase hundreds of radio stations, and when that owner's or potential buyer's name is George Soros, my ears perked up. And so we reached out to Commissioner Carr of the FCC and asked if he'd come on to talk about that, as well as a couple of other issues, and he was good enough to join us this morning. Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC, thank you so much for your time, sir. Good morning.
Yeah, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. I don't know if I framed this correctly, so I want to make sure I get all my facts correct. Is that about right, what I heard you say, that you are seeing a transaction here coming down the pike that the ordinary course of business is not being followed?
Yeah, you've got that right. Earlier this year, a Soros-backed group purchased over 200 local radio stations across 40 different markets or cities. And when they did that, they brought in some foreign investment, some excessive foreign investment under our rules, more than 25%. And when you do that, the FCC has a process for handling it. It's called sort of Team Telecom, where we bring in national security agencies, and they just make sure there's no issues at all with that foreign investment. That usually takes 6 months to a year. But in this particular case, the commission, for the first time ever, based on my review, is skipping that national security review and jumping straight to a vote on allowing these Soros-backed groups to get control of these stations immediately. And then the Soros groups say, well, don't worry, we'll come back down the road at some point and go through that, longer vetting process.
So let us buy them, and then we'll get back to you on who we are.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cart before the horse. And look, I think my view is, if you step back, your last name should not determine how the government treats you. So I'm opposed to this special Soros shortcut because everybody should go through the normal process. But yet what we're seeing right now across the government, across this administration, is a weaponization of government power based on whether your last name is Soros or Musk. You get very, very different treatment right now.
So when you hear something like, and I don't know that this falls under the FCC, given that it's, Meta or whatever, and correct me if I'm wrong, does like a Zuckerberg and social media fall under your purview at the FCC or no? Or is that something different?
It does, only to the extent that Section 230, which is this liability shield that allows a lot of the censorship that we've seen, is Section 230 of the Communications Act that the FCC implements. So there was a push during the last administration to get the FCC to adopt some rules around Section 230 that actually will promote more speech and create disincentives for censorship. But in the main, these are companies that in whole will be regulated more by the FTC than the FCC.
So Tim Walz, the guy that's running as the VP pick for Kamala Harris, meets in New York City just yesterday with Alex Soros, the son of George Soros. And you refer to this company or this group that wants to buy these hundreds of radio stations. And we're talking about Odyssey, to be clear, the Odyssey Broadcast Company, who went through reorganization, bankruptcy here recently. And the Soros group, lots and lots of dough, came swooping in, and they would own controlling interest of Odyssey. Is that right? By a little over half of the shares or something, if this purchase goes through. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's effectively right. Our review indicates that they would have effective control.
Mm-hmm. And so is that something, is it unfair to say that given how politically active the Soros name is it unfair to say that we as Americans who tune into some of these radio stations, particularly if they're radio stations that are associated with conservative talk, should we be concerned or mindful of who would now have controlling interest of those and why they'd be fast-tracked as potential buyers?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, there's at least a handful of conservative commentators that are on some of these stations. Sean Hannity's on 6 of them. Dana Lash is on 5. Mark Levin was on 4. He's now down to 3. One of the stations that's part of this deal, actually in Philadelphia, recently dropped him.
I'm familiar with them. Yes.
And so I think there is reason to be concerned. And look, I would love a lot more capital investment in local broadcasting, but to be honest with you, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing a lot of people that are billionaires saying, you know where I could stick my money and really turn a big profit is in local radio. And so I wish that were the case, and maybe the Soros Group sees something economically that we haven't seen before. But this doesn't look like an investment that's being done for the purpose of just, making money.
Now, I'm sure that my parent company, the Salem Media Group, wouldn't appreciate me bringing this up, but I'm just for the sake of transparency, I'll share it. I know that Salem tried to acquire some properties to expand their Christian teach and talk ministries in Florida, and as I understand it, the Soros Group swooped in and purchased those out from under them. Maybe it wasn't Florida, but somewhere else. Is that your understanding? They have a keen interest, in other words, the Soros Group does, in buying up radio stations and seemingly prohibiting other companies like Salem from buying them instead. Is that accurate or inaccurate?
Yeah, that Florida story that you articulated sounds right to me. And there's even, a separate Florida story where there was a different group of supposedly conservative buyers that wanted to buy some radio stations in South Florida. And a bunch of Democrats cried foul and said the FCC can't allow this because it might affect electoral outcomes. And so it's, the other side of the coin. They don't get the fast track. They get the slow track, to be sure. And we see in other places, too. There was at least 2 members of Congress, 2 Democrats from California, that wrote letters to cable companies saying they needed to drop Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax because they didn't like the editorial decisions that we're making. So, again, we're seeing, the government approach split onto 2 very different tracks based on the politics here. And that's a concerning trend. It should be concerning to everyone, I think.
Brendan Carr with us. He is chairman, not chairman, one of the commissioners of the FCC. Wish you were chairman. What is the makeup of the FCC, incidentally? Who runs it these days? We know Democrats, obviously the Biden administration, but what's the makeup? You do have to have representatives of both political parties on the panel, correct? The commission?
That's right, yeah. There's 5 commissioners. 3 are of the president's party. We have 3 Democrats right now, and there's 2 of us that are Republicans. So on, high-profile contested issues, you can get a 3-2 vote and sort of jam it through.
There's been, this is one I've been kind of uncomfortable to talk about because I just think you may disagree with me. I'm sort of a market guy on this one, so I haven't really beat the drum as loud on car companies deciding to go away from putting AM in new manufactured cars. And I know there's a bill being bandied about right now, and I know my company, full disclosure again, Salem Media Group, is one of the chief lobbyists. They want to see a bill mandating that car companies continue to offer AM radio in cars. I'll just stay agnostic on it for the moment, but ask you as a commissioner at the FCC how you see it.
Look, I think to your point, you can make a pretty rational limited government argument as to why the government shouldn't step in here. I sort of come down slightly differently on this particular one, in part because of the sort of the patchwork, the network of sort of public safety communications that as a federal policy matter relies on the presence of AM radio. I think that sort of maybe nudges us over the line, in my view, to say, yeah, I think we should step in because it's a relatively low cost to put these antennas in there. It's relatively low cost to shield them to make sure there's no interference from the electric vehicles. And so I'm supportive of it, but I do think reasonable people can come down differently on it.
Do you anticipate that there will be success in that bill getting to a president's desk, or is that something you would have to see in another administration?
I think so. I think this is one where we're seeing sort of pretty large bipartisan support for it. And so I'd be sort of optimistic or hopeful that this does pass at some point in the near term.
Oh, like this year, like before this session's out?
It's possible, yeah. It's been a little bit since I've checked in the actual status of the bills, but this is the type of thing that has a lot of support behind it.
So, Brandon Carr at the FCC, let me ask you about this ownership thing again. 200, we're talking about 40 different cities, 200 radio stations within those cities. This entire company, Odyssey, who owns all of these. But by the way, Odyssey, this is a company that owns radio stations that broadcast most major professional sports across the country, in addition to colleagues of mine that you mentioned that are on talk radio stations. Can listeners of those stations anticipate perhaps a change, or should they be mindful of programming changes coming down the pike if an ownership group like Soros takes majority control? Is that something, for instance, if a conservative show that you really enjoy on one of these stations is suddenly owned by a Soros group, is that something, I guess there's not much a listener could do if programming suddenly changes. But I think you should be mindful of who the ownership is, right?
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if it does not happen. In fact, the example you gave before where a Soros group moved into South Florida with radio stations, there was some conservative talent there, and they ended up leaving rather quickly. Now, it's a bit of a he said, she said as to exactly why and how, so I don't want to get into that. But, yeah, when you have an ownership change, it's, often par for the course. You can change formats, you can change talent up and down the dial.
So I just thought that was important that everybody know that's what's going on, and I appreciate your time on that. Let me also ask you quickly about a New York Post story I saw. Mr. Carr, headline: FCC delay to roll out of internet in rural communities slammed as worst abuse by commissioner. That's you. Worst abuse of any agency process I've seen in my 12 years of working at the FCC. What is this about? Rural internet is something most of us don't live rurally, so that doesn't mean much to most people. But as I talked with a member of Congress not too long ago about it, when you know that so much of people's livings now and so much telecommuting happens, you could revolutionize rural communities that don't have any means of income. Maybe they're small town, their factories, their businesses are mostly shuttered except a Walmart. You can revolutionize the country. Many rural residents could effectively become business entrepreneurs if they had access to high-speed internet like so many others in the suburbs and major cities do. So that's still a real issue for a lot of the country, correct?
Yeah, you're right. Look, back in 2021, Vice President Harris agreed to lead the administration's signature $42 billion plan to expand internet access to millions of rural Americans. And now, flash forward to today, it's been 1,045 days that Vice President Harris has been leading this initiative. And they have connected exactly 0 Americans, not one house, not one business. They haven't even started a single construction project after over 1,000 days. Pennsylvania alone was supposed to get $1.16 billion of the 42 to connect over 278,000 homes and businesses. And if you look at insiders that have been talking about Vice President Harris's management of this program, they say it's been chaotic. They said it's been delayed. They say it's been burdensome. And instead of just focusing on getting people connected, this program is being used to push DEI requirements, a climate change agenda, preferences for government-run networks. We really got to change course there.
That's a big deal. So when it comes to the nation's communications, this is also it's not typically a sexy headline. It's not something that usually comes up in presidential politics. But as a commissioner of the FCC, what would you say to voters about this coming election and how they should think about it in terms of the work you do?
Well, look, I think we need to change course. When it comes to this, $42 billion program in particular, we need to get rid of the DEI requirements, get rid of the climate change agenda, and you can very quickly get this thing turned around. I don't have a ton of confidence at the moment in the leadership that's doing this. In the financial world, we say that past performance is not indicative of future results, but in the policy world, that's all you have to go on. And Vice President Harris's leadership of this $42 billion program has been unable even to turn one shovel's worth of dirt.
And as just kind of a broad picture, Commissioner, I would ask you about the means by which people get their information. I'm here I am in middle age. I've put a lot of time and effort and love into my broadcast career, but I'm not a dummy. I understand that everything's rapidly shifting. People are now going in the digital direction, and it is, the pie has grown, but that means the slivers of everyone's pie is shrinking. And so it's no secret that the traditional broadcast model is challenged. But I don't mind competition. It's like Rush Limbaugh used to say, if you're doing a show worth hearing, people will use a tin can and a string to hear it. So I think that's on us to make compelling programming, and people will come find it. But how should we think about the way in which we get our information today? I mean, for instance, I see a bankruptcy court is going to sell off all of InfoWars and Alex Jones. And I'm not here to talk about Alex Jones, whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, but when you hear people like AOC talk about how we got to rein in misinformation, and a Mark Zuckerberg saying, yeah, I was leaned on to keep certain kinds of information from the American public. Should we be concerned, or is Soros buying up hundreds of radio stations and the Odyssey company? I mean, should these things concern us as Americans?
Well, look, there's that old saying, some version of, radio or audio is the most visual medium out there. I think there's something sort of true and intimate about the format, so I want it to succeed. But there are challenges, as you noted. There's a tremendous amount of new technology and competition, and frankly, the government is not helping. When you look at radio in particular, we have all of these regulations that have been in place for decades that were put in place when Americans got their news two ways: once in the morning when the newspaper clunked on your front doorstep, and once at night when you had one of your kids tune the rabbit ears to one of the three broadcast stations. But the way that Americans can get news and information now has shifted dramatically, and yet we so heavily regulate radio, and we don't regulate at all, social media and podcasts. And I'm not calling for the regulation of it, rather I'm calling for the deregulating of radio. But also there's a threat from, free speech in general, right? We're very much seeing a surge in censorship. You mentioned Zuckerberg. He said that he knuckled under to pressure from the Biden-Harris administration. So I think culturally, maybe the greatest threat is, this sort of move away from free speech, which was once a very progressive idea. We need to return to that.
Yeah, and Elon Musk, you must be very happy with the development of Elon Musk buying X and that platform being used as aggressively as it is. And by the way, Starlink is another development of his that may aid in the temporary problem with internet access, higher speed internet access for people in the rural areas. I mean, Elon alone seems to be revolutionizing the game for communication, and in a free speech trending way.
Yeah, you're right. You mentioned, Starlink. Back in 2020, we cut a deal with Starlink to provide high-speed internet to 640,000 rural homes and businesses across the country for just $1,300 in federal support. Now, flash forward to today, outside the $42 billion, which isn't connecting anybody, there's other federal programs, and Senator Cruz did a report showing that they're spending $100,000 or more per home or business in federal support. So we had a deal for $1,300 with Starlink. Now we're spending over $100,000. And I think we revoked, actually, the Biden-Harris administration revoked that Starlink award. I think all of this is just downstream from this administration's moves against Elon Musk. President Biden stood at the White House podium and said Elon Musk is worth being looked into. And since then, you've seen the revocation of that award, the FAA going after him, the DOJ going after him, the whole alphabet soup of agencies. Again, I think it's sort of evidence where your last name is determining how you're treated by the government right now.
Yeah, so we end where we started. The name Soros gets fast-tracked. The name Musk gets held up.
That's right.
Is that about right?
Yep.
Yeah. This has been really enlightening, Commissioner Carr. I'm grateful for your time. I hope we can have you back very, very soon, sir.
Happy to do it whenever you like. Happy to do it.
Holy cow, My Pillow has a massive sale going on right now. Back to tell you about Mike's big Christmas extravaganza. Now, $59.98 for flannel sheet sets. That's what he's offering, and it's not going to last long. They sell out of these every single year. The My Slippers, which Christine loves, I sent to the team a couple of years ago. People rave about these My Slippers. Normally $119.98. Mike's selling them for Christmas at just $59.98. The 6-piece towel set is back in stock at $29.98. And then, of course, the hundreds of My Pillow products. If you haven't actually gone to the website and shopped, now's your time, because Christmas, the sale is here. They're great gifts. Their 60-day money-back guarantee extends until March 1st on all these great potential gifts or just purchases for yourself, from bathrobes, duvets, quilts, down comforters. There's a ton there. And the coolest thing Mike does is if you use my name, Chris, as your promo code, Chris Podcast specifically, Chris or Chris Podcast, it works either way, but use the promo code Chris or Chris Podcast, and when you do, at mypillow.com or call 800-932-5056, he ships all of it to you for free. So all of those reduced prices on all that great stuff, the $59.98 flannel sheet sets, the 6-pack towel sets, the $29.98 price tag on those towel sets, unbeatable. And the 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st, shipped all of it to you for free on orders $75 or more. It's at mypillow.com, promo code Chris Podcast, or 800-932-5056. And Merry Christmas from Mike and the team at MyPillow.
Hey, what a thrill. This is a guy I've wanted to talk to for a long time. And just because the nature of our time zones, it's always been kind of difficult. But we were thrilled that he was able to make time for us today. And I am thrilled at watching all of the, what I guess might have been a call to career risk years and years ago, but not anymore. It's paid off because God's on the throne and God's been steering it all along, and Kirk never doubted it. Kirk Cameron, ladies and gentlemen, actor, author, and a brand new children's television project called Adventures with Iggy and Mr. Kirk. Kirk Cameron, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Chris, it's great to talk with you this morning. And so good to, you just like, I don't know, this is like what you just said was better than a shot of espresso in the morning to make me smile. You're just talking about God being on the throne, and you're talking about taking risks for the good and for the right and for the true. And man, you're the kind of guy that I want to hang out with.
Brother, thank you. May I tell you, I just hung out with your sister at the National Religious Broadcasters Association convention in Nashville, Bridget, who's written that new book.
Oh, well, that's great. Yes.
And she told us very specifically about you, and I didn't know the story about how she says that you were literally the one that brought all of your siblings to Christ. I assume you know that story.
Well, I've heard her tell that story, and of course, I played a small role in it. But you know, God has ways of doing things that are often unexpected, and they come out of left field. I mean, I was an atheist growing up, and it was a pretty girl that led me into church when I didn't want to have anything to do with religion. And lo and behold, I become a Christian, and the dominoes began to fall. My family was kind of in a tough spot with my parents breaking up. They were separated, and when I started going to church, everybody started following suit, and one by one, the Lord began to save them all.
I just thought that was the coolest thing, and your sister was so gracious in her thanks to you for that. And I don't know. I mean, I know you don't you're a humble guy, so you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but that's a bold statement. She said that you basically, in her view, kind of just, you re-steered the family, refocused the family, made them who they are today. I think that's an amazing tribute to you.
Well, I have 6 children, and if I really had the ability to steer people right into the kingdom of God, all of my children would be walking with Jesus. But I know that that's not the case. I can't do that. And I certainly didn't do it with my parents or my siblings either. God deserves all the credit for that. But he does use us as vessels and channels of his power, right? So amen to all the good things God's doing through us.
And I will also commend you for, it's compliments all around. I sat through a presentation not terribly long ago in my church, the Patriot Academy folks and Rick Green, and your involvement with that was deep as well. My point in all of this is you have seen avenues where you can advance the ball for the kingdom, and you take them. And it's like you're a rolling rock gathers no moss. You just keep moving and you keep going in new directions. And I want to talk about the new project, but it seems like you're jumping strategically at opportunities to advance that ball. Am I interpreting that right?
Well, that encourages me too, Chris. That's what I want to do. I want to be like that rolling rock that gathers no moss. What I'm hoping is to pick up some other rocks along the way, and we can snowball together as we pick up momentum for the sake of what is true and what is good and what is right. I think there's too many believers out there that lament the culture, and we, because we've gotten so discouraged, have really become professional whiners instead of being winners and creators of the culture. I think that's what we were created to do. I think that we were created to actually go into all areas of our society, starting with our homes, with our jobs, with our churches, our communities, our schools, and even the halls of Congress, locally and nationally, and create the environment that leads to people's blessing and their flourishing, rather than sitting on the couch watching Newsmax or Fox News with our head in our hands, crying in our Chick-fil-A soup while the culture deteriorates around us. That's not a winning plan. And I don't.
That is
think
one of the most. Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's not the plan, and that's not the trajectory of the gospel. The good news is that good wins out over evil, and I believe that happens in time, in history, in the land of the living. We don't need to wait to heaven for the victory party. We're not fighting for victory. We're fighting from victory when Jesus rose from the dead. So let's kick in, let's knock off the moss, and let's work together to pick up more momentum for what is good and true.
Kirk Cameron's brand new children's television show, Adventures with Iggy and Mr. Kirk. Watchbrave.com, the website, and there are a myriad of different projects you've been involved with here. I will just say quickly, before we move off what you just said, and that is, what drives me nuts is it seems that there are a lot of people that want to put the moral fabric and the moral battle in this country on a presidential election, and I think that's a terrible mistake. I couldn't agree with you more. Our elections matter, and we should participate. But to hang the future of things like abortion in this country, you got to win hearts, and Jesus is what wins hearts. Kirk, right? It's not going to be a presidential election. I'm sorry to say.
I think you're right. Although we can err on both sides by vacating the civil government sphere of influence, we can actually attract nasty, perverted, twisted, and dark people into the places that create the laws, which then shut down your radio program, which then shut down my church, like they did in California, where you couldn't go to church to have communion on Good Friday or Easter, but you could show up at a strip joint, at a weed shop, or an abortion clinic, because of the laws of godless governments in our area. So we can't win the culture, and we cannot solve the problems unless we turn our hearts back to God. But we must also not neglect the family, the church, or civil government. If we do, we're sunk as well. So it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Brilliant. Absolutely right. Couldn't add more to it. Now, watchbrave.com. Correct me if I'm wrong. Have you also been a part of the Brave book series as well?
Yes. Yeah. So Brave Books is a company that's just doing phenomenal things. They're a scrappy new company out of Texas, and they are creating books for kids that build their character, that have beautiful animation, great storytelling. And this is contra the drag queen story hours, the perverted material coming out of scholastic books through their book fairs into public schools and libraries now. And the stuff that we're seeing in Nickelodeon and Disney and all of this stuff that's leading these kids down the road toward, drag queen stuff and gender confusion and transgender body mutilation and all of this. So I've been working with them to write books, and now we've got a brand new children's program coming out called The Adventures of Iggy and Mr. Kirk. And we want this to be our generation's version of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Oh, that's awesome. Will you be wearing the cardigan?
This may give you some serious Mr. Rogers vibes, but it's updated, and it's got timeless biblical moral values. Beautiful animation. We've got a legendary puppeteer from Sesame Street who worked with Jim Henson and the Muppets, We've got actors and actresses from television shows that you'll remember, and it's going to be awesome. What was I going to tell you? We're going to be teaching kids not only timeless moral virtue, but we're going to be teaching them contemporary lessons like one story is called Elephants Are Not Birds, and it's a lesson about gender reality for children. Another one is called The Island of Free Ice Cream, which is all about warning kids about the dangers of socialism. So if you think about it, Mr. Rogers never had to deal with these topics when his show was on, but we do have to talk about them, unfortunately, today, because the opposition is teaching your 3-year-olds and your 5-year-olds stuff about these topics through their cartoons, their music, their TV shows, their TikTok channels, their Instagram platforms. And so we need to combat that with the truth in a way that kids will love and understand.
Kirk Cameron, it has been gnawing at me, this gender stuff, exclusively because, in my opinion, I don't know if you view it the same, if you can convince the public that God makes mistakes and that you can just monkey around and change your gender, he didn't mean to make you the way you are, if you're effective in selling that message, then you can effectively just negate God altogether, can you not? That seems to strike at the heart of the whole argument.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's the point. I think that is the plan. If we do a little digging into history, we find that the whole government school, the whole public school idea comes out of the mind of a man named Horace Mann, who in Massachusetts set that whole system up. And you look at those that he taught, you get down to John Dewey, who was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. And the whole point is ultimately to try to pull off this charade that you can be good without God. And without God, you ultimately become your own standard, and now anything is acceptable. And that's how we wind up where we are today. We're a boat without an anchor. We're a kite without string. And so now boys can get pregnant, and now girls can have beards now, and whatever. But good becomes evil, evil becomes good. And up becomes down, and down becomes up. And if we don't right the ship, if we don't re-anchor ourselves to things that are true and good, the future doesn't look good. But like you said, we know the one who's on the throne, and his power working in the hearts of everyday people can turn things around.
I saw you give a very powerful sermon, and forgive me for not remembering the exact church where you gave it, but it was an enormous congregation. I was struck at your ability to preach. I don't think I really realized that. Maybe you do that a lot, and I didn't know that. I mean, I know you've obviously acted. I know your projects. I followed a lot of your work, but I was really impressed by your preaching. Do you enjoy that?
Oh, well, preaching is kind of that's a bad word to some people.
I guess it's a negative word.
Don't preach at me, but I think it's a good word. And I don't consider myself a really all that great of an actor, or really certainly I'm not a preacher. I'm not a politician, but I get fired up about stuff that I believe in, and I do enjoy being up on a stage. I do enjoy sharing what I'm learning with other people, hoping that they can learn it. I think that probably comes from growing up in Hollywood. I grew up on a stage on Growing Pains in front of a live audience since I was 14 years old, and it's just become like any other muscle that you work a lot, you develop it. And so I think I'd like to think that everything in our past is God's preparation for what he prepares us to do in the future. And if that's sharing the word of God with people, man, I'm ready to go. Let's do it.
Kirk Cameron's new children's television show is called Adventures with Iggy and Mr. Kirk. WatchBrave.com for more information. WatchBrave.com. I'll close with a question about fatherhood. I'm a dad of teenagers now. You're a dad of 6, you said, and you said something interesting.
Oh, I'll pray for you.
Thank you. And I don't want to pry or be too personal, of course, and you don't have to answer this, but I think about this all the time. You've led your kids to Christ as best you can, I assume, raised them in a Christian home. I've done the same or tried. But at what point do you have to just let go? I heard someone say recently that, and I think it was Dennis Prager, who said something to the effect of, you can lead your kids, but then, you shouldn't take too much credit or too much blame. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like Dennis Prager. Boy, yeah, I think that's the right direction. I mean, I look at me and I say, I'm the last guy I ever would have thought who would have been talking about God and about Jesus Christ, because I was an atheist. I wasn't looking for God. And there was a minister who once said to me, Kirk, if anyone ever asks you, how did you find God in Hollywood? Remember this, you didn't find God. He wasn't lost. You were, and he found you. Mm. And I think that also applies to our children. We can lead them to their hope and to their salvation, but ultimately, God's the one who's got to open their eyes, and he's the one who's got to bring them in. And so, I don't want to be a stumbling block. I don't want to stand in the way. I want to be a living, breathing example of a person who loves God and cares for his family. But at the end of the day, I've got to recognize that this is between each individual person and the Almighty. And I just pray that God does the work that I know I can't do.
And I assume you're candid with your kids as they've grown. Your background in atheism, or have you not really talked much about that with them?
Oh yeah, I definitely have. And while I'm trying to lead them toward Jesus, Coors and Bud Light is trying to lead them toward debauchery. We've all got a real world that our kids have to grow up in, and so they've got to wrestle through these things on their own. And they've got to determine who am I and whose am I and what am I living for?
I want to thank you personally. I've never spoken with you before, but again, like I've said, I've watched you from afar and always hoped that we could get you on the show so that I could say thank you for living boldly. You've been doing it for far longer than I ever tried to do it. I've been in broadcasting a long time, and only recently have I started to feel inclined to start speaking about the love and goodness of Christ. And I waited far too long, and you didn't. And I admire you for it. So I appreciate all that you've done.
Chris, with you. I bet if we lived closer, we'd be pals. You have the gift of encouragement and all the good things that you're doing, I'm so grateful for. So let's all continue to uproot evil in the fields that we know. God's placed you here on this program, placed me out in crazy California making movies and books and stuff like that. And wherever God has placed you who are listening, know that he's equipped you, he's prepared you, and you can do what only you can do in the places God's placed you. And while we're ripping up the evil, let's plant seeds of truth and goodness and beauty and trust God for the growth and the harvest.
WatchBrave.com. Adventures with Iggy and Mr. Kirk, a brand new children's television show. I hope you show your kids and grandkids. Kirk Cameron, it's a real pleasure, sir. I hope you'll come back and see us sometime.
I would love to. Thanks so much, Chris.
The Chris Stigall Show podcast.